Again. Hello and welcome to the Miami Showband Peace Centre online. We continue with our series of Speaking for Myself. And today our witnesses are Jennifer McNern, who was badly injured in March in 1972, and Peter Heathwood, who was injured in 1979 in a case of mistaken identity. But both Jennifer and Peter will tell us about their stories themselves. As panelists today, and we're very happy to have two teachers, Denver Charles and Denise Johnston, who will comment on the testimony on the witness impact statement that they've just heard with regard to our theme today of education. So without further ado, we'll hand you over to Jennifer McNern.
Hello, my name is Jennifer McNern, and I was born and bred in Belfast. And at the age of 21, I went into town one Saturday with my sister, general shopping. She was getting married, sort of looking around for things. And we went to the Abercorn restaurant for a coffee. We were there for about 20 minutes and just about to leave, and a no warning bomb went off. I don't remember anything about what happened. I have no memory even to this day. But I lost both legs, and my sister lost both legs and an arm and the sight of one eye. There were other people injured as well, and two girls were killed outright. I was 21 years of age. I was free. I went to danced the Miami Showband many a time, and just enjoying life. So whenever I woke up in hospital, I woke up in Ward 17 of the Royal Victoria Hospital, and I didn't know why I was there. I didn't know why I was in hospital. Even though seemingly every day I'd been told why I was there. But this day I woke up and a nurse was passing my bed, and I said, "Where am I?" And she said, "You're in the Royal Victoria Hospital. You've been in a bomb explosion." So my arm was in plaster, so I just went back to sleep again, obviously on drugs or whatever. But when I eventually found out, I remember my mum was in visiting one day, and she was just leaving, and I turned in the bed to go to sleep, and as I lifted the blankets, I noticed my right leg was missing. I remember just screaming, and my mother was walking down the old corridor in the Royal Victoria Hospital, and she heard me, and she came running back in, and I was sedated. And the next day, the doctor in the ward came in and told me the extent of my injuries, that I had just lost my right leg. I had lost my left leg as well. At that time, I didn't know about my sister. I wasn't even asking about her. Just shows you where your head is. But I eventually found out she was in intensive care on a respirator. And she had lost both legs and an arm and the sight of one eye. We didn't see each other for quite some time. I couldn't get out of bed because of fractures, and she couldn't get out of bed because she was in intensive care. To think back of how we actually got through that scenario, it's say 48 years ago. I just don't know how we did. I don't know how my mother coped with it. My mother was a widow at the time, and she had 3 other children as well at home. But I remember my mother walking into the ward one day, and she was ashen. And I remember looking at her and thinking, this is not all about me. This is about my mum as well. So every day, at the time, I knew my mum would be coming to visit. I would put the makeup on, I would have a smile on my face, and everything was okay. And that's the way it continued. We came home. We came home to a 3-story house, steps to get in. There was nothing in place for us at all. After you got out of hospital, there was no help. So we struggled on and eventually moved to England, and then eventually I moved back again. I just wanted to move back to Belfast. Life was difficult because your whole identity changes. You've gone from someone who was dancing around the place and free and easy to someone who is disabled. And to be disabled in the Northern Ireland in 1972, no wonder we didn't see disabled people. They must have been around, but you couldn't get around. There was no disabled toilets. There was no ramps. Footpaths were the old Victorian big steep footpaths. It was very, very difficult to lead a life, and I found it very difficult with people looking at me. I remember, and people were so free to come up to you and say, "What happens?" You know, and I used to say, and then I would go, and they would say, "Was it a car crash?" And I would say, "Yes." I totally denied that it was a bomb explosion. I couldn't actually say the words. I was in a bomb explosion. We struggled through, and I'm going to bring it up to 1998 now, the Good Friday Agreement. I was waiting. I was sitting by the TV waiting on, I can never remember his name, Secretary of State at the time. And I thought they must say something about disabled people, people who have been left with traumatic injury. Peter Mandelson. And he said, and for victims, I'll talk about that in a minute. So I waited, and then he said, a memorial fund will be set up. I was devastated, and off he went. And so the memorial fund was set up, and I was asked if I needed a washing machine or a fridge. Well, that was it. I was out of my corner. I hadn't been angry from 72 to 98, but written down somewhere many years that is. But that's when my anger started. I was so angry. And after what, not just me, but my sister and especially my mother had been through to see her two daughters ripped apart the way they were, for somebody to ask me if I needed a fridge or a washing machine just did not go down very well. I was angry, but along with that anger, I was depressed. First time I had actually gone down emotionally, and it was friends who pointed that out to me. You know, I wasn't aware I was depressed, and I love getting angry. I just loved it. The minute I could hear somebody talking about something, I needed something to make me angry, you know, because we went in our house, we didn't talk about what happened. Nobody talked about it because in case you upset somebody. So therefore, you didn't show anger, you didn't show any emotion at all about what had happened. So therefore, this new anger that I had found was brilliant. I could actually feel release from it. But it was getting to a dangerous stage. I was suicidal. I was having dreadful thoughts of ending my life. And so eventually, anyway, friends trailed me off to the doctor, and the statutory services didn't know what to do with me. So we have a conflict that had been going on for so long, and the statutory service were not aware of victims of conflict. Absolutely outrageous. But thankfully, my doctor knew about the WAVE organisation, and I went over to WAVE one day, and I spoke to the Sandra there. And on my way home, I remember I was driving back home, and I remember thinking, I've got two homes now. I have a home where I can talk about what happened, and then I have the other home where you don't talk about it at all. And that was a great relief for me. After that, I went back into education. My I think really just for personal development and to sort of build my confidence. I wasn't aware that that was going to happen at the time, but it did. I did an access course, and I eventually found myself at Queen's University. And the nun said I wouldn't ever get to university, but there I was, wheeling myself around Queen's University here in Belfast, and I had an absolutely fabulous time there. So when I came out, when I had finished, my confidence was back up again, and I got this call one day, and it was from Bertha McDougall, and she said, "Would you like to join the Victims Forum?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you want to think about it?" I said, "No." I said, "Yes, I want to join the Victims Forum." And there was my outlet. If I hadn't gone back, I think, into education, I don't think I would have had the confidence to do it. But I went in and I was sitting in a room with IRA, people who had done UVA, police, victims. And I just thoroughly enjoyed it. And I got on with everybody. I had no problem talking to anyone, which was great. On the when I was on the Victims and Survivors Forum, I was on the Services Committee, so that sort of gave me an angle then to get things done, and that was a hard push as well, getting things done, getting the proper things done. You know, not the fridges and the washing machine stuff, but you know, actually getting actual help, and especially financial help for people who weren't able to sort of get back into the workplace. Meanwhile, at Wave, I had met all these wonderful people as well. And it's quite interesting because all our stories were much the same. You got on with it. You didn't talk about it. You were poorly compensated. You were given to probably live for 10 years. And here you are, you know, all these years later, you're still alive. Your compensation has gone. You couldn't get a mortgage because you weren't working. You had to pay cash for everything. So it wasn't long disappearing. So we decided we would go for a pension for people who have been left with chronic disability. And out on the streets, campaigning over to Westminster, Stormont. And it was a hard slog to get our politicians here to listen. It was tea and sympathy for a long time. And then, not so long ago, Stormont fell, and it was out of action for 3 years. So that's we eventually ended over at Westminster, and it was there that we were listened to, and eventually got our pension into legislation, signed into legislation 2020. It was 2014. Not the Good Friday Agreement, the Stormont House Agreement said more to be done. Let's do more work on that. So 2014 to 2020, there was nothing done, absolutely nothing. So eventually it was signed into legislation in 2020 and was supposed to be paid out in March 29th of this year. A week before it was supposed to have been paid out, news came out. It might run a few months late. And then eventually the crunch news came. It's not going to happen at all. And why? Because there was nothing done about it. Absolutely nothing. And that was devastating. So is this nothing being done is the problem? There's lots being done. And really the push is by victims and survivors themselves. But by our people on the Hill, no. There are genuine people who want to do something, but unfortunately, they're not in the powerful position to do it. So on Monday, I'm in court just to see what a judge is going to say about it. So that's been my journey. And as I say, it's quite traumatic, but I'll have to say along the way, I met great people. And helping hand, always there. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Jennifer. I find it very interesting when I read your story and when I watched your films, the fact that you were trying to hide your injuries from your mother, that even though you had these dreadful injuries and your sister also, that you were thinking of your mother's feelings as opposed to your own. I mean, if we can speak to Peter Heathwood.
On that night when I came up home from Lisburn, I was sitting at 3 children at the time. Patrick was 6, Anne-Marie was 4, and the baby was only 3 months old. I was sitting in the wee back room, a wee tiny room, playing with Louise, the baby, on a wee baby bouncer, and the doorbell rang. And Anne got up to answer the door, no big deal. And the next thing I heard her squealing, gunmen, gunmen. And Belfast in the 70s, when somebody shouted that, you know, they weren't joking. I jumped up, there was no way out of the room, so I got behind the big heavy oak doors that the house had. Gunman had Anne, he had a balaclava and all, and he had Anne by the hair, and he was pulling her up the hall. She was squealing and shouting. As he's come into the room, he let Anne go when he seen me behind the door. I pulled Anne round and whacked him with the door. I'm 6'3" and I was about 14 stone. I knocked him flying into the hall and threw my body against the door, put the bar in the door. Unknown to me at that time, there was a second gunman in the hall. Boom, 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 through the door. And he got lucky. Went down through my shoulder, broke up 9 ribs, hit the spine. The front bullet, the front one went through the front of me. And the third bullet that was fired missed the baby's head by literally inches. But it lifted me right up into the air. I remember like in the movies, and I was a big fella, about 14 stone, just feet left the ground, and I could see myself coming down in slow motion. And the fireplace was there, and Anne put her hand out. I can see that to this day, stop my head hitting the hearth. And when I tried to get up again, my legs wouldn't work. But they didn't get in to the room. The bar on the door had held it. The one in the hall panicked them. Anne was squealing, the children were squealing, and they run out the house. And Anne said, I turned to her and I said, tell Daddy I'm all right, and then passed out. Now, why I would have said that is I knew my father had angina. Anyway, Anne phoned the police, the ambulance, and phoned my family back in the Ormer Road. The policemen in uniform got there first, and to their credit, all this is Anne's testimony, they stopped the bleeding, done all that CPR stuff that they do with you when you're injured. At the moment the ambulance got there, it was a bit delayed. My parents arrived with my sister and my brothers. My sister's a nurse. My father and my mother got out of the car. And at that time, the ambulance men couldn't get the gurney into the house. So they put me in a body bag to bring me out to the ambulance. Daddy seen me in the body bag and said, oh, my poor Peter, and dropped dead of a heart attack.
Oh, God.
I didn't know this. I wasn't aware of any of this. He just went down on the floor. Again, my sister CPR'd, the uniformed officers were there at the time, done all the CPR that they could, but Daddy was dead. And unknown to me, when I got to the Royal, he was in the next cubicle to me. And that was about it. That night, that's what happened. I don't remember, like Jenny, full of morphine. I remember nobody was to tell me about Daddy then. It was a month before anybody was able to tell me that. I was taken to the Royal first and saved my life in the Royal. It stopped. The bloods were full, the lung was full of blood, pumped all that out. Then I was into the city, the Royal, intensive care. But I was high on morphine the whole time. I don't remember being in the real world. It's all like a blank to me until they moved me across to Musgrave Park, which is a rehab clinic. In Musgrave Park, I remember the doctor, I went down to 7 stone in weight. I was in a rotary bed. The legs had come through my skin. The bone at the base of my spine had come out. These are called pressure sores where the bone comes through. My hair had fallen out. I remember the doctor saying to me, I mean, there's no sort of making it easy. He says, Peter, see that wheelchair, son? I said, aye. He says, get used to it. You've been it for the rest of your life. And that's how it was broke to me, that I was paralysed. And then on top of that, hearing that my father had died. But I was in hospital for 50 weeks. And the first part of that was about survival. Anne would have come up with the 3 children to visit me. She couldn't drive. She had to go and learn and drive. We had to get out of the house in the Cliftonville. She moved over to her mother's house. But I was in that hospital for a year and I was institutionalized. I didn't see the effect of the violence that night on the rest of my family till I got out of hospital. When I got out of hospital, I stayed with my mother's house in Fitzroy Avenue, the Armour Road, and Anne was at the top of the Armour Road with her family. And we went to court in 1981, got criminal indemnity compensation, which I accepted. I didn't even make any argument about it at the time because I wanted to buy a bungalow to get the family back together again, which I'd done. I bought a bungalow at Dunmurray. When I got the family back together again, I noticed Anne's health had deteriorated. When the news came on, another murder, her eyes turned to stone and she just went like into this trance. And 1984, she took an overdose, but I had spotted it and I got the ambulance and they got her into hospital. And that was the first time then. It was Dr. John Alderdice, was a psychiatrist. He used to be, ended up the leader of the Alliance Party. He was her psychiatrist. And he says that Anne suffered from PTSD. She was getting flashbacks every time something came on the news. And they give her treatment for that, which was basically talking to psychiatrists. But Anne's health went down. She started drinking, and wouldn't have been drinking every day. It would have been every couple of months. Something would come on, more mass murders, and she'd have just taken vodka to her room and just got whacked. And I remember saying to Anne, we have 3 children, love. We have got to get through this. We have got to get through this. What can we do that will help you? And she just looked at me and said, it's my fault. I opened the door. I let them in. She'd never forgive herself that she had opened the door that night. And I said to her, look, Anne, you shouted me a warning. If you hadn't given me a warning, I'd have been sitting on the sofa. I was a dead man. You give me a warning, I was able to struggle with them. No, didn't do. And sadly, Anne died at 51. And for me at that time, losing Anne was worse than losing my legs. It was devastating. Sorry, still devastating. But it's the ripple effect of violence that people don't see. Now, I, like Jenny, was a trained teacher. I was an insurance salesman in charge of 6 people. I knew I was a people person. I could talk to people. I could sell snow to the Eskimos if I had to. But nobody would give me a job in the 80s. The teachers at that time, again, no disability discrimination. When I applied to schools, oh, we can't move all the classes to the ground floor to suit you. And the insurance people, no, Peter, that was about you getting in there, big lad, 6'3" with a big smile. You can't go and do that job in a wheelchair if you turn up and there's steps into the house. They didn't want me. They didn't want me. And I left, I turned my attention to rearing my children and trying to look after my wife. And my whole life was spent doing that. I have a daughter, a social worker, and another daughter, a teacher. But their lives suffer too. You know, I could see the effect on them. And at that particular time, in 1981, I remember the VCR came out. And being a history teacher, I realized what we were living through here in the Troubles was history, historic times. I started recording all the newses and documentaries. I'd done it in a separate room where Anne couldn't see me doing it. That archive grew and grew and grew. It's now part of the Keane archive at the University of Ulster. And again, my reasoning back then was that the news is the first draft of history. What you see in the news is the draft of history. And I was also very aware that those who do not understand the past are condemned to repeat it. So when the archive got bigger and I connected up with the University of Ulster, I wanted it in the universities. I wanted children who go to university, the next generation, to be able to see the futility of violence, you know, on the news. And what did it ever get anybody? Nobody won, everybody lost. All our families, thousands of families that suffered during this, destroyed families. And I've been asked a million times, Peter, what's the most saddest thing in the whole archive? And there's like 3,000 hours of this stuff. And I tell you what it is. It's the funerals. And that funeral can be an IRA man, a UVF man, a policeman, or a UDR man. But that family, you see that family, they're broken. And that's the message that needs to get across to future generations here. When the flag wavers start on both sides waving flags, they got but that's going nowhere. That is going nowhere but self-destruction. And I'm hoping that my legacy, that archive, can be seen by future leaders at universities, and that message can get across to them. But the big thing on my own personal case is the ripple effect of violence. I never, to this day, I never got to my daddy's funeral. There was no news coverage of it because that was the weekend the Pope visited Ireland. So even though I have this massive archive, I've tried all the TV companies and I can't get that. And I miss that. I miss that bit of closure. My wife died, 51 years of age. We should still be together now in our mid-60s, you know, enjoying 14 grandchildren. And that was another thing. When the doctor said to me in hospital, Anne was told on 2 occasions I'd be dead in the morning. And Dr. Gibbons, he was an RAF doctor, a thoracic surgeon, and he had one of them big RAF mustaches up here. And he said to me, Peter, how did you survive? He says, because you should be dead, you should be dead. And I said to him, I want to see my children grow up and I want to see my grandchildren. And them bastards aren't going to kill me. And I remember saying that to him. And I've got 14 grandchildren now. So I consider, for all their efforts that night to kill me, they failed. I won. I had 14 grandchildren, and we're still a family. But I never got over the effect on the rest of the family. It was horrific. And it's the same, Jenny's just told you hers. You can talk to thousands of people, you'll get that same reaction. And basically that's my story.
A very, very powerful story. And because the theme of our program today is about education, I think that everybody needs to hear that story. And Jenny as well mentions that the happiest time was when she was in university studying. Is that right, Jenny?
Yes. It was just part of after the Good Friday Agreement and feeling down. It's just somewhere, as I say, I ended up. So I don't think anybody knew what had happened to me. I was just the girl in the wheelchair.
Denise, you're. I hope we can get to talk to you for a while, because I think there's a glitch in the audio there. But as a teacher, you must find these stories very, very powerful. I know you were involved with TaRP and also with with WAVE. Are these stories being told to the young people today?
Well, we're certainly in our school, and I know in Denver's school as well, we are making sure that those stories are reaching the children. But not every school's doing that, and that's the problem. It's very important that we get to all schools, basically, if we can, because it's so important that children hear these stories. In terms of, first of all, thank you, all of you have been here today, especially Peter and Jennifer, because, and I'm sure sometimes maybe you get a bit fed up telling the story over and over again. I hope you don't, because it is so important that so many people, not just a lot of adults need to hear these stories as well, that missed out on learning about the troubles when they were at school. So we've shared history, and it's a mangle of intertwined singular narratives. It's as complex as it is horrific, and its truth is hidden by our own perceptions or by the perceptions of others. Quite often, the children, their understanding of history is the perceptions of others. And the danger in that is that it fuels a singular narrative of our history. So teaching history is about giving kids the tools, and Denver will no doubt agree with that. But our job as historians and as teachers is to give the kids the tools so that they can work out what's true. Okay. Nothing in history happens because of one cause. All significant events are multi-causal, some perhaps more important than others, but the understanding of them all is essential. So the topic of the Troubles is seen by many in very simple terms. Different reasons for this, very limited understanding of what happened, a limited interest. A lot of young people don't care. You know, that's in the past, we were thinking about the future, and they don't really understand what happened. And there's, again, that can be down to, they can have very limited interpretations of the history, just a version that they've heard and they accept it, and that's it. But we as teachers who teach history would be failing our youngsters if we avoided teaching the Troubles to them, as was done for many years. And how often, I know, I'm sure Denver will agree, you hear adults saying, oh, we never learned about that, and we never talked about the Troubles, or, you know, it wasn't taught in our school, or we learned British history, or we learned American history, but, you know, we avoided this white elephant in the room and learned about the Troubles. But we've moved on from that. And certainly for GCSE, the C, of course, now really does address the Troubles and the beginning of the Troubles. So the other thing is, if we don't do this in schools with young people, where else will they get that safe environment where they get a variety of interpretations, where they'll be able to ask questions freely, they'll be able to debate stuff if they don't do it in school. So that's why we do it. So coming back to the testimonies of Jennifer and Peter, and of course, I've done this in schools quite a few years now. I'm having yourself and Stephen telling your story, having Michael Gallagher and Eugene and Joe's in, Peter and Jennifer both in our school as well. It's just completely invaluable for the young people to hear these first-hand experiences. And for many years when we were doing GCSE history, we would have taken kids off to see a Holocaust survivor. And that's what gave me the idea for getting, you know, victims of the Troubles into the schools. Because here we were, getting this brilliant experience, listening to a witness testimony of someone who was in one of these concentration camps telling their story. And yet, no, we weren't doing that with the Troubles. We weren't getting people in, and so many people out there with their stories, and I think many people wanted to tell their stories and had no outlet to tell their stories out there. So for us, it was very, very important. This was an opportunity we could grasp and start to approach people to come into school and talk to the kids. So there's lots of benefits for that for the kids, and again, it's hard to beat. And Peter, you will know this, a primary source. When you get those first-hand accounts, more inclined to be truthful for a start off, and it can shock some children that do go in there with different perceptions of what happened. And maybe Eugene, maybe you can come back to that later on. You talked to that young fellow whose father was a police officer who had, you know, told you what he had got from your talk. So it's very important to hear these truthful accounts that highlight the absolute horror of the Troubles and the utility of violence. Peter talked about that, and Jennifer will talk about that as well. Because these kids have this sort of romantic view of our history, where we had these freedom fighters, and we had these defenders of, they were out there doing good, they were trying to save the people. And yes, that's one interpretation of our history, but the consequences of the actions were horrific, and then it glossed over, and kids need to know that this was a terrible, terrible time, and that the impact of this is still being felt by these people, by these families, either because they lost a loved one, or because they were horrifically injured. So it's that ripple effect, of course, that Peter talked about there. It doesn't just, not one person's affected, it's a whole family and friends that's affected by, you know, either someone injured or someone being killed. So it's a huge impact. And I don't think the children really have a sense of that until, again, they hear the victims tell their stories. Again, it gives young people then the opportunity to ask questions and ask questions of you know, those of you who have experienced these terrible tragedies. Okay, so the other thing I'd like to say about that is just that I think it's so important because for me, reconciliation of our people is what drives me. And in order to get reconciliation, we need people to empathise. And the greatest gift we can give our young people through these, victim testimonies in schools, or whatever way we do it, and there's lots of ways to do it now, is to give them that sense of empathy where they can empathise with the other side. So they're not just thinking along that singular narrative that I talked about earlier on, that they begin to think about, well, what was it like for somebody from that community, or what was it like for someone who's a policeman living in Northern Ireland. So just trying to get them to empathise, and because I think that if we're going to get reconciliation, that's an absolute essential ingredient.
If we can ask Denver, are they already conditioned?
Well, I would actually say that that's a complicated thing to answer, because as Denise quite rightly pointed out, many of the students don't have an interest in the Troubles, as they see it as a long time ago, and they don't necessarily see it as particularly relevant to them. There are many reasons as to why that might be the case, but certainly 20 years post-conflict, I see it absolutely essential that we actually bring in witnesses and victims of the Troubles, because if you look at the GCSE curriculum, it's a very political curriculum, as in Sunnydale, hunger strikes, the consequences of the hunger strikes, and then what happened the whole way up to the Good Friday Agreement. I think actually bringing in victims to give their stories as the kids do that course actually gives them the multi-perspectivity that Denise has been talking about, brings in all of the perspectives in relation to the Troubles and the peace story and what happened after the peace story. And I think that's extremely important. We have definitely got involved with this platform at both Key Stage 3 with Year 10 students and GCSE, and we've also done it within the shared education sector. So are some students having a dialogue with their parents and grandparents? I believe that that's the case, and I believe they're starting to talk about things that happened in the past, and they're getting their grandparents and their parents' narrative in relation to that. So it's important. Now, that's not wrong in itself, but it's important that in the educational sector that there is all of the perspectives and all of the voices are actually heard. And these voices that we're hearing today, Peter and Jennifer, and I've heard Eugene, and I've heard you as well, these are very powerful testimonies. And whenever the students would come back into my school, depending on where we have the program, I would always get them to write to the people that spoke or to say what they thought about what was happening. And always whenever they actually do that and they reflect on what they've just heard, it's really, really powerful, the impact that this has on students from age 14 right up to age 18. And it's extremely valuable program. And actually, when you listen to Eugene and you hear the profound impact, or Peter or Jennifer, and you hear the profound impact that violence had on society, I think it's, children do get the message that violence is not the way forward. And they do get the message that this was, although some may have disengaged with the Troubles as history now, they do realize that, they want a different society than their parents and their grandparents lived through. And definitely this program fulfills its remit in getting that message across. And there's no better people to actually tell that message than the people who have suffered so much and so profoundly.
Well, I am interested in knowing if we say we've moved on. There was a time back when Jennifer was impacted, and of course Peter as well, that Peter makes it very clear that the way the doctor told him, broke the news to him, if you can call it that, about saying, look at that wheelchair, you better get used to it. I mean, there was no such thing as counselling back when Eugene Reavey's family were impacted by the loss of his 3 brothers, or when Joe Campbell's father was killed. We were told to get on with it. But an extreme case of not talking about it has to be, and one of the most extreme cases I've ever heard has to be Jennifer's case, that here she was with her sister looking at each other in the same room and not talking about this, and that Jennifer had to go to WAVE, which is a wonderful organization, so that she could feel comfortable. When I cross the border and I meet people like Jennifer and Joe and Peter and Eugene and Alan McBride and all of these people, there is a certain comfort in being with them, because they are the very few people that understand that. Is there now an appetite for talking about it? Do the schools and even the parents, do they feel that it is actually healthier to talk about these things?
Well, I think actually, and Denise will probably come in here as well, I actually feel that it's progressively getting to a point where more and more people want to talk about it, and they want to actually get the testimonies, and they want to investigate the history, because, you know, that's taken 20 years. I can report positively here that we have no students really, you know, you have to ask for the consent of parents in relation to the Truth and Reconciliation Platform programme. And we have very few students that refuse to go along to it. And that would have been a very different case 20 years ago if you could have had a programme like this 20 years ago. So I would just like to say there is an appetite to actually get involved in these discussions and actually hearing the honest stories of victims.
Well, if I can finish up with Joe, give Joe the last word here. Joe, you've been listening to the testimonies here. I mean, you have to be, like me, and struck by the dignity and the courage of Jennifer and Peter. But also by the courage of Denver and Denise and other teachers and schools that have the courage to bring this into the schools and to say, you know what, you really need to get the truth. How important do you think that is, Joe?
Oh, it's massively important, Steve. Now, first, I'd just like to thank Peter and Jennifer for their testimonies. We've heard a lot of testimonies over the years, but you can't help but be moved by the way they delivered it, with the dignity, with the humanity. I think what the testimonies also showed us was the cruelty of violence, the spread of the violence, not just for the individuals, victims and survivors, but the family, the wider family, and the community. And it is a generational thing. And I think when young people hear these testimonies, hopefully they'll realize that acts of violence cannot be undone. When you say something, you can unsay it at a point, but acts of violence cannot be undone. And there is no cause, whatever. There's no romance about the violence and the cruelty that was visited on all of us during that time that was known as the Troubles. I liked what Peter said about news. I think if I quoted you right, news was the first draft of history.
Yeah.
I think we're still writing our history, and the testimonies of ourselves and other people that we're very close to will show people that, perhaps we don't know the full detail of the history, but as we do, we learn from it, and we can ensure that it doesn't ever happen again.